In this video, I'm going to discuss how B Priestley presents the character of Sybil, or Mrs. Birling, over the course of the play. I shall explore not only the way in which she is portrayed as a character who resolutely refuses either to accept any responsibility for her actions or to change her attitude and her behaviour, but I shall also explain her dramatic function, i.e., how Priestley uses his characterisation of her not only to add tension and drama, but also to communicate his beliefs about everything that he felt was wrong with British society in the first half of the 20th century. If we look at the play as an allegory, we can see that as a character, Sybil Birling represents just one facet of the middle class, represented by the Birling family as a whole. As a family, they are wealthy and live an extremely comfortable and cocooned life, which we can see from Priestley's directions for how the stage should look. An Edwardian middle-class female, Mrs. Birling has three roles: as the wife of Arthur Birling, a prominent local businessman, as a mother to Sheila and Eric, and as a local public figure. A former mayoress, she is now a prominent member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation. As Priestley successively puts all of these roles under the spotlight, he reveals her to be the embodiment of the smug complacency, superiority, rank hypocrisy, and unrepentant callousness of a self-entitled middle class that he despised, who believed prejudice against those who were poorer and weaker to be their birthright. Mrs. Birling is described in the stage directions as about 50, a rather cold woman and her husband's social superior. She's not like her husband, as it is implied that she perhaps comes from the landed gentry class. Arthur Birling, on the other hand, is a self-made man, apparent from the way in which he is described as being rather provincial in his speech. In other words, he has a local accent, suggesting that he has not attended a public school, with the further implication that he has not always been so wealthy. We can infer from this and from Mrs. Birling's behaviour towards him that she is painfully aware of his social inferiority and is embarrassed by his non-observance of social etiquette, especially in front of Gerald, who is also her husband's social superior. When Birling asks her to pass on his compliments about the evening meal to the cook, she responds, reproachfully, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things." And when he gives his lengthy speech about the impossibility of war, finishing with his contemptuous opinion that Russia will always be behindhand naturally, she interjects with, "Arthur." As a wife, she does not appear warm with her husband. Not only does she reproach him for what he says and appear to be embarrassed by him, but she also goes as far as to turn on him, as well as on her children, when she defiantly tells the inspector that, unlike the other three, I did nothing I am ashamed of, or that won't bear investigation. Any sense of loyalty that she may have felt towards her husband seems to have vanished as defending herself becomes her top priority. As she starts to feel backed into a corner by the inspector's aggressive interrogation and the comments of the other members of her family, she hits back, agitated now, and putting the blame firmly on her husband. "Oh, stop it, both of you. And please remember before you start accusing me of anything again that it wasn't I who had her turned out of her employment," which probably began it all. Mrs. Birling's innate sense of superiority is also evident in the way in which she speaks to the inspector. She is at pains to remind him of her husband's local standing in the town. "You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago and that he's still a magistrate," with the implication that he should show more deference towards them, and reprimands him for his manner when he dares to disagree with her. That, I consider, is a trifle impertinent, Inspector. She clearly feels that the inspector has no authority over her and that he does not have the right to challenge her. When he questions her as to whether or not she was in the chair at the meeting of the interviewing committee, she defiantly responds, "And if I was, what business is it of yours?" Priestley also constructs Mrs. Birling as a character with failings as a mother, as well as a wife. Cold and selfish, she is fixed in her ideas and doesn't try to understand her children. When Sheila challenges Gerald over his absence the previous summer, she interrupts with, "Now, Sheila, don't tease him. When you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business." It's apparent from her words that she believes in traditional roles, that men and their work take precedence while women stay, uncomplainingly, at home. The way in which she says, "You'll have to get used to that, just as I had," suggests that she is unable to feel any empathy, even for those that she purports to love. She suffered from loneliness as a young bride, and now Sheila will, in her turn, also have to suffer, because that is just the way things are. She also treats Sheila and Eric as though they are still children. She doesn't allow them to speak for themselves, answering Gerald's question to Sheila, "I've been trying long enough, haven't I? Haven't I? You know I have," with, "Of course she does." When the women leave after dinner to go to the drawing room, she directs Eric to follow her. "Eric, I want you a minute," presumably to order him like a child not to drink any more. She later describes him to the inspector using language which infantilises him, saying that he seems to be in an excitable, silly mood. Mrs. Birling shows herself to be out of touch and very naive, unable to see what is going on under her nose. She lives in a fantasy world where men in prominent public positions, such as Alderman Meggerty, lead upstanding lives, where her adult offspring are still children, and where her son doesn't have a drinking problem. When the inspector asks her if Eric is used to drinking, she is shocked, responding, "No, of course not. He's only a boy." The inspector immediately challenges her by responding, "No, he's a young man, and some young men drink far too much." As Sheila confirms that this is indeed true, she still refuses to believe it. Staggered, it isn't true. It is, however, when the spotlight shines on her in her role as a member of the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation that the true negative qualities of her character become apparent. Firstly, she shows herself to be an unashamed liar. When the inspector asks her if she recognises Eva from the photograph, she denies it outright, saying, "No, why should I?" Her use of a rhetorical question here, evidence of her defiance. She's also complacent and smug. When asked by the inspector if she is indeed a member of the charity organisation, she replies in a self-congratulatory manner, with dignity, "Yes, we've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases." Hand in hand with this complacency, however, is a fragile ego which is very easily pricked, highlighted through her reaction to Eva's unfortunate choice of Mrs. Birling as a false name. "Yes, I think it was simply a piece of gross impertinence, quite deliberate, and naturally that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case." Mrs. Birling's use of language here is very interesting. The use of the word deliberate to describe Eva's unfortunate slip is indeed evidence of her prejudice to think the worst of her, which she freely admits to as something which she feels is only natural. Her lack of shame here reveals her innate belief that her superiority is untouchable, and her admission also gives us a further understanding of her criteria for a case being deemed deserving. Presumably, Eva had too much pride and was not sufficiently grovelling and lacking in self-dignity to warrant the pitiful amount of charity the committee would have actually dispensed. In the same way that she does not have the ability to put herself, as a mother, in her own daughter's shoes, Mrs. Birling shows that she is incapable of having empathy or even sympathy for Eva's position as a mother-to-be. Earlier in the evening, on first meeting the inspector, she says, "I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class. As far as she is concerned, the lower classes are morally inferior and are not to be understood." It is clear that Mrs. Birling is unable to equate her own experiences of motherhood with those of someone from the working class. The inspector highlights this by drawing attention to her own capacity as a mother and her callous attitude when faced with a pregnant Eva, as he rebukes her. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, and friendliness. You've had children. You must have known what she was feeling. And you slammed the door in her face. She is unrepentant, though, as she declares in her own defence that she was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. Scruples are doubts or hesitations about the morality of a course of action, and refer not only to Eva's unwillingness to marry a drunken young idler, as Mrs. Birling puts it, who was not of her class, but also to her refusal to take suspected stolen money from him, which she dismisses as some fancy reason, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. As far as she is concerned, the faceless working-class poor are incapable of acting in a moral way, and are therefore in a no-win situation. Eva finds herself damned for refusing money that has been illegally obtained, but she would have been equally damned for having taken it, because that's what girls of that sort do. Not only is Mrs. Birling totally lacking in compassion for Eva when she is alive, she is also totally lacking in remorse when she finds out that she is dead. "I'm very sorry, but I think she had only herself to blame." Of all the characters in the play, she seems to be the most resistant to change. She is incapable of learning anything about herself from the inspector, as her way of seeing the world and her place in it are too deeply entrenched. She has never known any different. It is how she has been brought up. The shock revelation, for the family at least, that Eric is responsible for Eva's pregnancy is the point at which Mrs. Birling's failings as a public figure and as a mother collide in what is arguably the play's most dramatic moment. In terms of the way in which the play is structured, the first 3 confessionals are told in the order in which they happen. Mr. Birling is first to have dealings with Eva Smith. Her dismissal from the factory leads her to take a job at Millward's, where she then loses that job because of Sheila's bad temper and jealousy. Her inability to get further employment leads her to embark on the life of a prostitute at the Palace Theatre bar, where she meets Gerald Croft. Chronologically speaking, Eric's confession about his role in Eva Smith's suicide should come next. This, however, is switched with Mrs. Birling's interrogation by the inspector, so the family find out that Eva was pregnant and needed charitable aid before they find out who was responsible. This provides a coup de théâtre, or a sensational turn of events which is heavy on dramatic irony. Priestley places Eric's involvement at the end of the sequence to expose the rank hypocrisy and blind prejudice which he saw in the middle classes, and which is embodied at its starkest in the character of Mrs. Birling. When Mrs. Birling is ignorant of the identity of the father, her condemnation of him is damning. "I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If, as she said, he didn't belong to her class and was some drunken young idler, then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him." She then, in an attempt to distance herself even further from the responsibility, goes as far as to advise the inspector, "And if you take some steps to find this young man, and then make sure that he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility, instead of staying here and asking quite unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty." When, however, she finds out that it is in fact Eric, she says, "But I didn't know it was you. I never dreamt. Besides, you're not the type. You don't get drunk." Note the way in which she emphasises the word "you" here, clearly demonstrating that there is one rule for us and one rule for everybody else. If she had been aware before that Eric was responsible, the last things she would be advocating would be a forced marriage or a public confession. As Eric says to her when he returns, bitterly, "You haven't made it any easier for me, have you, Mother?" Eric also needs to be the final link in the chain in order to demonstrate Priestley's belief in the most dramatic way possible that we are all one community, and that when we harm someone else, however minor we think it is, we effectively harm ourselves. Through her callous actions, Mrs. Birling has unwittingly played a part in the death of her own grandchild, and has caused irreparable damage to the relationship with her own son, as he in his own turn condemns her. "Then you killed her. She came to you to protect me, and you turned her away. Yes, and you killed her. And the child she'd have had too. My child. Your own grandchild. You killed them both. Damn you, damn you." Priestley shows us here how this self-serving behaviour ultimately leads to our own pain and suffering. Not only is Mrs. Birling morally responsible for the death of her own grandchild, but she has also succeeded in causing a rift with her son as he turns on her. "You don't understand anything. You never did. You never even tried. You—" This moment brings him almost to breaking point as he reveals his pent-up resentment and frustration at being infantilized, rather than nurtured, by her all his life. After the inspector has left and the recriminations begin, Mrs. Birling reveals that her core beliefs remain intact. Self-preservation is her number one priority, and she has still failed to grasp that Sheila and Eric are, in fact, adults. She rebukes them. "Really, from the way you children talk, you might be wanting to help him instead of us. Now just be quiet so that your father can decide what we ought to do." When they find out that the inspector is not on the police force in Brumley and is probably not in the police at all, she insists that she was right about him all along. Triumphantly, "Didn't I tell you? Didn't I say I couldn't imagine a real police inspector talking like that to us?" When they find out that no woman has died in the infirmary that evening, she demonstrates that she has totally missed the point of the whole exercise. Sheila sums it up nicely when she says, "But you're forgetting one thing I still can't forget. Everything we said had happened really had happened. If it didn't end tragically, then that's lucky for us, but it might have done." When Sheila declares sarcastically to her mother, "So nothing really happened, so there's nothing to be sorry for, nothing to learn. We can all go on behaving just as we did," she responds, "Well, why shouldn't we?" Her complacent rhetorical question here showing that she has learned absolutely nothing and has no intentions of changing her beliefs or her behaviour at all. Priestley presents the character of Sybil Birling with absolutely no redeeming qualities whatsoever, suggesting that he saw a rigid class system which allowed the upper and middle classes to perpetuate social inequality through the exploitation of the weak and vulnerable as the root of the problem, and one which could only be fixed through education of the younger generation. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques, and English literature texts.